On September 22, 1979, U.S. spy satellites detected a nuclear explosion over the Atlantic, and no one still knows who exactly tested the nuclear bomb. A subscriber with the nickname Charlie suggested making a video about an alleged nuclear test conducted by Israel and South Africa. These tests are also known as the Vela incident. Thanks for the suggested topic, especially since I've been meaning to make this video for a long time. Suggest topics for future videos. So, you are on the Wisioner channel. Let's get started. In 1963, the US began launching the Vela series of satellites to monitor the USSR's compliance with the treaty banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. The reason was simple. All of the reconnaissance methods of the time did not allow guaranteed detection of a nuclear explosion in the atmosphere at great distances from a ground or airborne observer. The territory of the USSR, on the other hand, made it easy to hide anything at a very great distance from its state borders. And so the project to create a space control system began. As it turned out, the Soviet Union did not violate the treaty, but France and China, which had not signed it, successfully conducted atmospheric nuclear explosions. And everything would have continued in the career of these satellites, and gradually they would have joined the list of a huge number of other spacecraft series, about which it is interesting to know only to narrow specialists, if not for one event. A flash over the ocean. On the night of 21/22, the Vela satellite with number 6911 recorded a double flash, characteristic of an atmospheric nuclear test, in the South Atlantic, between the Crozet Islands and the Prince Edward Islands. Over the years, the Vela satellites have recorded 41 double flashes, each of which has subsequently been recognized by a country as a nuclear test. But this time there was a unique situation: no one claimed responsibility for the explosion. The parameters of the flare corresponded roughly to an atmospheric explosion of about 2 to 3 kilotons. And most importantly, it was a double flash, which is characteristic only for nuclear tests. It could not be a meteorite fall. A meteorite is characterized by a single flash, or anything else. There were other curious anomalies. Thus, Radio Telexop in Arecibo recorded an anomalous ionospheric wave, which moved from southeast to northwest. Also, a network of hydrophones, deployed to detect and track Soviet nuclear submarines, recorded an acoustic shock roughly equivalent to that of a 2 to 3 kiloton explosion. No traces of elevated radioactive isotopes could be found by aircraft. On the other hand, since the explosion was atmospheric and, apparently, quite high altitude, then, based on the wind pattern, the entrainment could have taken place in the direction of Australia and New Zealand. And after a while, the news came from there. In Australia, abnormal levels of iodine-131 were found in sheep on the islands of Victoria and Tasmania, although not much higher than normal. An urgent telegram on November 13, 1979, from the American Embassy in Wellington, New Zealand, stated, "Scientists in New Zealand believe they have found evidence that a nuclear device has been detonated in the southern hemisphere during the past 3 months." Experts from a local institute analyzed samples of rainwater and found barium-140 and other short-lived isotopes from nuclear tests. Thus, US intelligence agencies concluded that it was a nuclear test. But whose? American intelligence quickly began to compile a list of suspects. And it began to rapidly reduce it. The Soviet Union was clearly not suitable for the role of the culprit. If only because it had enough desert territories, but it had problems with access to the remotest corners of the southern hemisphere. And there were no violations of the 1963 treaty, and Soviet scientists learned how to successfully solve the problem of improving nuclear weapons during underground tests. China was also not suitable for this role, but for a different reason. Beijing was then free to conduct atmospheric nuclear tests at the test site on its territory, and therefore it simply did not make sense for it to attempt clandestine explosions. France, on the other hand, had only recently thundered into the atmosphere, but even for violations it was much better suited to its possessions in the Pacific. But the most important thing here is that all the other members of the old nuclear club themselves did not have clear information about who had tested the nuclear bomb. Therefore, they had to turn their attention immediately to the countries that had military nuclear programs. India was rejected at once, because no activity of its fleet or aviation in the bordering regions on those dates was noted at all. That left the two main suspects, South Africa and Israel. The Pretoria bomb? In the late 1970s, the Republic of South Africa was pursuing a nuclear program and was doing so quite successfully. However, today its involvement seems highly questionable. First of all, South Africa's nuclear program is now quite well declassified. And there is no information about that explosion in the materials. Secondly, South Africa's military nuclear program was not too large in itself, both in terms of the resources involved and the number of specialists involved. Fewer than 100 people were involved in the nuclear charges, which means that it would have been extremely difficult to hide the manufacture of even one extra device and conceal it until now. Thirdly, South Africa reported rather tightly on the production and expenditure of enriched uranium. No significant discrepancies can be seen. After all, South Africa's inability to covertly carry out a nuclear explosion in the late 1970s is based on a combination of the balance of uranium production and the peculiarities of bomb design in the country. Unlike most nuclear weapon states, the so-called cannon scheme was taken as the basis there. This scheme is very simple to implement and reliable, but there is an important problem. Huge consumption of uranium, about 50 to 55 kilograms per charge. Charges that use a different principle of operation, and thus are able to do with considerably less uranium, are a fantasy for South Africa in the late 1970s. So a mismatch of half a centner of weapons-grade uranium would have been impossible to conceal in reality. Israeli trail. Israel had very close contacts with the authorities in South Africa at the time. Cooperation was close and trustworthy not only in the field of conventional weapons, but also on nuclear programs. Right up to the exchange of materials used in nuclear weapons. Despite the fact that Israel had received information from France about its nuclear tests, it was still constructing its own charges. This means that ideally it would have been nice to have at least one classic nuclear explosion, even if it was of low power. Besides, Israel could not afford to openly test nuclear weapons. Even back then, the US had a whole series of regulations that demanded that aid to Israel be cut off if it was found to be conducting a nuclear weapons program. And there was no place for it to do so. The territory is tiny. The neutral waters of the Mediterranean Sea were also completely unsuitable for a covert nuclear explosion. Israel began separating weapons-grade plutonium in 1965 and produced its first device in 1966. By 1979, it had enough free material for one test device, unlike South Africa. The nuclear device itself is not so difficult to transport in parts and assemble on site. And most importantly, to test the bomb over the ocean you do not need too many people and instruments. In order to check the power, it is sufficient to measure the fireball produced by the explosion. This does not require a large fleet of observation vessels. You just need one observation and measurement vessel. And the nuclear charge for detonation can be placed on a small boat or on an aerostat. Organizing all this from an ally's naval base is not at all difficult. It is important to stress that there is no direct evidence that Israel has tested a nuclear bomb. This means that formally a certain state has managed, in its own time, not only to successfully implement a nuclear program, but also to secretly test the nuclear weapons it has developed. Dark finale. Nowadays it is not possible to conceal such tests. Modern radionuclide analysis alone would quickly detect the fact of such an explosion no matter where in the world it occurred. But at the end of the 1970s, in a remote area of the world ocean, such a test was still realistic. It was enough that there were dense clouds over the place of the low explosion. Apparently, it was the weather that failed the testers. It is unlikely that they would have cancelled the explosion of the charge that had already been placed for the tests with the automatic system on because of the change in cloud cover. So they lit up both literally and figuratively. But on the other hand, they did not catch anyone by the hand. That is why this unique episode will remain the only nobody's nuclear explosion. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends. Give it a thumbs up. Tell us interesting facts you know about the topic of this video. See you in new videos.